5 years ago, when I was in my late teens and early 20s, I worked as a dancer and lived in some rough neighborhoods. Because I was young and didn't know any better, I ended up in a few risky situations, so I was renting a place in one of the worst parts of my small city. My boyfriend at the time lived nearby, just down a long one-way street that led to a big intersection, so it was around 10 p.m. on Christmas night, and he had just gotten back from spending time at his family's house. He mentioned he had a few things to take care of at home, so I was left waiting for him. Now, at the time, I didn't have a car, and since he hadn't bothered to pick me up on his way back, I was getting more and more frustrated. Eventually, I decided to walk to his apartment. It wasn't a smart choice, especially since the street I had to walk down was a long one-way road in a really bad neighborhood. The area was known for being dangerous, especially at night. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to get to his place and didn't want to wait any longer. The street was set up with a few houses, but most of it was taken up by a big elementary school and a huge recreational field next to it. The whole area was really dark at night, and to get to his house I had to walk against traffic, so any cars coming down the road would be facing me directly. I made it about halfway down the street. On my right side was the school and the field, and on my left was the road, and that's when I noticed a car coming toward me. I didn't think much about the car, but then it started to slow down as it pulled up next to me. All four windows rolled down. Inside there were four big young men, two in the front and two in the back. They started shouting at me and saying other inappropriate things in a really aggressive way. I tried to ignore them and kept walking, but I sped up, hoping to get to the busy, well-lit intersection near my boyfriend's house as quickly as possible. At this point, they were yelling at me to come back, but there wasn't really any space for them to turn the car around. The only way they could circle back around was across street far down the road. I was already feeling nervous, but then things got worse. Out of nowhere, they put the car in park and all four of them started getting out. As soon as I saw them getting out of the car, I started running as fast as I could toward the intersection. I honestly don't think I've ever run that fast in my life, thankfully, because it was a one-way street. I was already pretty far ahead of them. By the time they got out of the car, they didn't have enough time to circle back around before I made it to my boyfriend's house. I'm not even sure if they tried, but just knowing they put the car in park in the middle of the street, got out in the freezing cold, and started yelling and coming after me was terrifying. When I told my boyfriend, he was really upset that I didn't just wait for him. He said it could have ended really badly. And honestly, I believe he's right. It goes without saying that this wasn't the first time something like this happened, but it was definitely the last time I walked around that neighborhood alone at night. Christmas Eve had always been a big deal in our family. Every year we hosted a dinner at my grandparents' house in San Diego. It wasn't a fancy place, but there was something about its worn-out carpet and the way the living room smelled like cinnamon that felt like home. That year the house was lit up with colorful Christmas lights. The tree was piled high with presents, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted turkey and baked ham. The night started like any other Christmas Eve. Relatives trickled in slowly, some carrying dishes, others just bringing themselves and their stories. Uncle Rick came with his famous green bean casserole, and Aunt Susan brought a pie that looked suspiciously store-bought. My cousin Jenna kept snapping pictures of everything and everyone, making sure to capture the perfect Instagram moment. The kids ran around the house, their laughter mixing with the faint hum of Christmas songs playing in the background. The dinner table was a sight to behold, plates piled high with food, glasses filled with wine and soda, and candles flickering in the center. It was warm, loud, and full of life. Everyone was talking over each other, sharing jokes, and reminiscing about past Christmases. It felt perfect in its messy, chaotic way. Then there was him. I didn't catch his name when he arrived, and honestly, I wasn't even sure who had invited him. He looked out of place, sitting quietly at the end of the table. He was tall, with a pale complexion and thinning hair slicked back. His clothes were neat but oddly dated, like he had stepped out of an old photograph. He didn't eat much, just moved his food around on his plate and occasionally sipped from his glass. No one seemed to mind him though. If anything, they acted like he had always been part of the family. It wasn't until dessert was being served that things started to feel off. Jenna, ever the photographer, wanted to take a group picture. She asked everyone to gather in the living room, and we all shuffled over, laughing and teasing each other as we tried to squeeze into the frame. The man hesitated, but followed us. After a moment, when the camera's flash went off, he flinched like it had burned him. I remember him standing slightly apart from the group, his expression unreadable. The photo was odd. As Jenna looked at it on her phone, her smile faded. She turned the screen to me, and I immediately saw why. Everyone was there, smiling and happy. But the man looked blurred, almost like he had been moving when the picture was taken. The thing was, he hadn't moved. He had been perfectly still. Probably just a glitch, I said, though my voice didn't sound as confident as I wanted it to. We went back to the table for dessert. By now the kids were winding down, their energy spent, and the adults were settling into a comfortable buzz from the wine. The man stayed quiet, his eyes darting around the room like he was looking for something or someone. I tried not to stare, but something was unsettling about him. His presence felt heavy. It happened just as we were finishing dessert. The man suddenly stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Everyone turned to look at him. He was shaking, his face pale and glistening with sweat. Then, without a word, he let out a scream, a raw, guttural sound that froze everyone in place. Before anyone could react, he bolted out the front door. For a moment, no one moved. We just sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Then Uncle Rick stood up, muttering something about going after him. A few others followed, grabbing their coats and flashlights. I stayed behind with the kids, who were now clinging to their parents, wide-eyed and scared. The minutes stretched on. I could hear the muffled sound of voices outside calling the man's name, though no one seemed to know what it was. After what felt like an eternity, the search party came back empty-handed. They had followed his tracks into the woods behind the house, but they just stopped. No sign of him, no footprints leading away, nothing. We called the police, of course. They came, asked questions and searched the area, but there was no trace of the man. No one could even agree on what he had looked like. Some said he had brown hair, others swore it was black. One of my aunts insisted his eyes had been green, but I remembered them as gray. It was like he had been a different person to everyone who saw him. The rest of the night was tense. No one wanted to leave, but no one wanted to stay either. The laughter and warmth from earlier were gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. When we finally did go home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the woods. The next morning, Christmas Day, felt hollow. We opened presents and tried to act like everything was normal, but it wasn't. The man's absence hung over us like a shadow. The police called to say they had found no leads and the case was closed. Just another missing person in a world full of them. Weeks passed and life went on, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I started avoiding family gatherings, unable to face the questions and the unease. I even stopped going to my grandparents' house. It didn't feel like home anymore. A few months later, Jenna sent me a message. She had been going through her photos from that night and found something. It was another group picture taken earlier in the evening. In the corner of the frame near the doorway was the man. He wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, his eyes were fixed on me, his face twisted into a smile that sent a cold wave of dread through me. I deleted the message and blocked Jenna's number. I didn't want to know anymore. It was a Christmas evening in 2012, and at the time I was about 16 or 17 years old. My mom and I were on our way home after a long, fun day with our extended family in Greater London. As we drove, the hum of the car engine was the background to our conversation. At first we talked about how much we enjoyed Christmas and the funny stories shared with family, but then the conversation shifted to Santa Claus. And from there we started talking about other holiday characters like the Easter Bunny and the tooth fairy, and jokes about how magical these stories felt when I was younger. As we talked, I brought up a memory from my childhood. My mom used to keep my baby teeth in a small jar with a blue fairy sitting on top. It was a delicate jar, and I could picture it so clearly, the bright blue fairy with tiny wings perched on the lid. I told my mom how much I used to love that jar. It always felt special, like it held a bit of magic from my childhood. But as I spoke, I realized I hadn't seen it in years. I remembered the last time I saw the jar. It had black duct tape wrapped around it, probably to keep it from opening by accident. If I had to guess, I'd say that was years ago, maybe around 2007, about 5 years earlier. When we were packing to move house, we talked for a while about baby teeth in the jar. My mom said she hadn't seen it in a long time either and hoped it hadn't been lost. During the house move, we both felt a little sad, thinking it might be gone, but we weren't sure. I thought it was a bit gross that my mom had kept all my teeth and that they were just sitting somewhere in the house. We laughed about it and kept talking for a while before moving on to another topic. Not long after we arrived home, we walked through the front door and greeted our dog, as we always did. My mom headed into the kitchen and I followed right behind her, and there on the kitchen floor was the small jar. It was broken into 2 pieces, and all the tiny baby teeth were scattered across the floor. At first I thought my mom was trying to scare me, even though she had never played a prank on me in her entire life. But when I looked at her face, I realized she wasn't behind it, and she was just as shocked as I was. That's when I knew this wasn't her doing. Without wasting a second, she grabbed her phone and started calling everyone she could think of, friends, family, anyone, to tell them what had happened. Meanwhile, I stood there staring at the mess on the floor. How had the jar ended up here right after we had just been talking about it? My dog Pika was already pretty old at the time, probably around 11 years, and she was very calm and well behaved. When we weren't home, she would mostly just nap or quietly wait for us to come back. She never went through our belongings or caused any kind of mess. In fact, it wasn't even possible for her to get into most of our stuff, since everything was stored in drawers or cupboards that she couldn't reach even if she tried. I looked around the kitchen trying to make sense of it all. How could the jar, which I hadn't seen in years, suddenly appear here broken and scattered on the floor? And why now, just after we'd been talking about it? It felt so bizarre and completely unexplainable. I still can't figure out how it happened or what caused it. It's one of those moments that stays with you no matter how much time passes.